Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Yeah, it went into the wee hours last evening. I think they're still cleaning up Statuary Hall after a record-long State of the Union address. And so we're peeking out of one eye this morning in the nation's capital, and maybe that's the case around the country. How many people watched that thing? I can't wait to see the number. Last year was 36 million. Did 36 million or more sit through an hour and 47 minutes last night? If so, man, we've got something. So thanks for joining us. If you were up late, especially on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power, we've got a full day of coverage planned for you on this day after the speech. No real insights into Iran last evening, and definitely no announcement of strikes. So that story remains in play, as does the story about tariffs and, of course, the president's hopes for a better economy in the new year. Of course, we know going into this speech that he was underwater on some pretty big issues. We talk about it every day here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, streaming live on YouTube right now. You can find us by searching Bloomberg Business News Live. We're always with you on Bloomberg Originals here from Washington as well, because affordability, of course, has been the mantra, right? We talk about it every day. And the president has found himself underwater in major polling from major firms we talk about every day. We just had Cliff Young from Ipsos in here recently. It's not just the economy, the affordability issue, the stubborn last mile when it comes to inflation, or maybe it's a new mile when it comes to tariffs, but it's also immigration and the outrage that we've seen by so many in the country over the deadly shootings that took place in Minnesota, the call by Democrats to take the masks off, to put the badges and the IDs on, and to get a judicial warrant if you want to knock down somebody's door. This is why, by the way, that whole situation is why the Department of Homeland Security remains shut this day after the State of the Union. So it's clear on the two big issues. Pick your poll. The president has found himself struggling on the keys that got him elected: the economy, affordability, if you will, dare we use that word, and immigration. Now, knowing that that's where we stand in the public opinion polls, the president of the United States stands before the American people with this message.
Our country is winning again. In fact, we're winning so much that we really don't know what to do about it. People are asking me, please, 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 Mr. President, we're winning too much. We can't take it anymore. We're not used to winning in our country. Until you came along, we're just always losing, but now we're winning too much.
Can't take it anymore. And so the president wakes up to a new day, having projected the golden age last evening before the American people and before a joint session of Congress. And that's where we start this morning with Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, who was up late with us, too. And she's back at it at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Tyler, we can't take it anymore. No 2-hour speeches, not after this. What's the vibe at the White House today? And what's the message that the administration is trying to frame coming out of this speech, Tyler?
Well, Joe, it's actually relatively quiet here at the White House today, with the president having no public events after what is now considered to be the longest State of the Union address in U.S. history. But it was very clear that President Trump had a goal to make the focus all about domestic issues, despite foreign policy headlines really dominating the conversation here in Washington in recent weeks. I think it's fair to say, considering that we do know, and as you alluded to with recent polling, this White House has really been playing defense when it comes to affordability. And the president did that by touting prior accomplishments, right? Really pushing ahead when it comes to those tax cuts under the One Big Beautiful Bill. As it appears, this White House is banking on larger refunds, more cash in consumers' pockets as they head into the midterms. President Trump also doubled down on his tariff plans. We can talk about that a little later, too. But it's really important to note that we didn't really get a lot of new policy proposals from the president. There was a nod to a potential new retirement savings plan for workers that do not currently have an employer-sponsored one. Perhaps we'll get some more details on that too. But a lot of the president's speech when it came to the economy and those affordability proposals seemed to be geared at lawmakers to try to help him codify some of those ideas that we've already heard, including banning institutional investors from buying single-family homes, as well as pushing forward his health care framework, which we haven't really heard that much about, considering that at the end of the year we were talking so much about what the future of health care and pricing would look like. Joe, as you well know, President Trump's plan is really centered on the idea of trying to shift federal subsidies from insurance companies to American consumers. But this is going to be a key focus of the president's as we go forward. But it's important to note a lot of these plans don't really have that backing from Republicans in Congress, and there's only so much he can do with unilateral authority.
Now, that's a perfect job putting structure around a nearly 2-hour-long speech that hopscotched through a lot of topics. Tyler, thank you. And I want to just, while Tyler puts structure around this, I'm going to stay at 30,000 feet here because the president started on the economy, right? Could have started anywhere, but it was affordability, right? It was inflation. America is back. Gas prices are down. The investments are up. Listen.
The roaring economy is roaring like never before. One of the primary reasons for our country's stunning economic turnaround were tariffs. Mortgage rates are the lowest in 4 years and falling fast. American oil production is up by more than 600,000 barrels a day. Democrats are destroying our country, but we've stopped it just in the nick of time, didn't we?
Oh, did you hear that turn at the end there? And that's important, Tyler. He started with affordability, knowing that a lot of people are probably going to hear, the first 30 minutes of this thing before they either give up or go get some popcorn or go to bed. Things got a little darker in the second half of the speech, Tyler, when he started yelling at Ilhan Omar and others, started calling Democrats crazy people. And those words were in the speech. That was in the script, wasn't it?
It was, according to the prepared remarks that us reporters received directly from the White House. And I think it's fair to say that there were very few moments of bipartisanship. We did see some moments, including when President Trump called for that legislation to pass that would curb insider trading in Congress, for example. But when it comes to immigration, that really seemed to be the main flashpoint between Republicans and Democrats. You mentioned that heated moment between Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and President Trump. And it was also interesting to hear the president call for the immediate resumption of funding for the Department of Homeland Security. This was one of the first State of the Union addresses to be conducted amid a partial government shutdown as we head into next week, and hundreds of thousands of DHS employees could miss their first paycheck. But to hear the president talk about that without us getting any indication that we are any closer to a deal when it comes to curbs on immigration and customs enforcement. This, of course, is going to be necessary as Democrats are really holding the line that they need to see some of those reforms. You spoke to a lot of them yesterday on Capitol Hill when it comes to the idea of demasking federal agents involved in immigration operations, also those new judicial warrant requirements, because, Joe, at the moment, the most concrete change that we've seen have been the mandate for body cameras on federal agents. But again, that's not codified into law. Republicans have often pushed that things could be done through executive action, but Democrats are holding firm. They need to see that tangible legislation to get on board with reopening DHS.
Tyler Kendall perfectly walking us through what was discussed last evening. Tyler, interesting in some cases what was not. In our remaining moment, we can start with China, by the way. I don't want that box truck to knock you over. If you're with us on YouTube, you got to love what happens on the North Lawn. Tyler, China, was that intentionally left out of the speech so the president didn't affect the summit in April?
Well, we can't say for sure. The White House hasn't commented, but pretty remarkable, Joe. This actually marks the first time in over 2 decades that a U.S. president hasn't directly addressed U.S. economic ties related to China. And as you're alluding to here, the timing is perhaps raising some questions as we look ahead to the next few weeks. And President Trump is set to come face to face with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing, marking the first time that an American president will be in China since President Trump went last time in 2017. And there's a lot of talk here in Washington about how the president's leverage, his hand going into this meeting, may be undercut in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling against his IEEPA tariffs. Now, to be sure, there are still rather high rates against Chinese imports. Our analysts at Bloomberg Economics have crunched the numbers. It's around 21%. So you ask the administration, they say nothing's changed, but an interesting tidbit to pick up on that China was not mentioned last night. Yeah,
absolutely. Tyler, great to have you back among the living today. Thanks for being with us here in the update live from the White House. Our friend Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We'll have much more straight ahead.
Stay with us on Balance of Power. We'll have much more coming up after this.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We consider the topic of tariffs and what President Trump suggested he will do. Let's hear from President Trump in his own words on this subject in the State of the Union last night.
Our nation is back. Bigger, better, richer, and stronger than ever before. I used these tariffs, took in hundreds of billions of dollars to make great deals for our country, both economically and on a national security basis. Almost all countries and corporations want to keep the deal that they already made, right, Scott? Knowing that the legal power that I, as president, have to make a new deal could be far worse for them. And therefore, they will continue to work along the same successful path that we had negotiated before the Supreme Court's unfortunate involvement.
So for more on this subject and others, we turn live to Capitol Hill, where Republican Senator Steve Daines is joining us. He, of course, represents the state of Montana. Senator, thank you for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. You have a seat on the Finance Committee. I know you pay attention to the issues of tariffs closely. The president said in his remarks last night, in addition to outlining the justification for tariffs, what he thinks it will do for the economy, he said congressional action will not be necessary in terms of pursuing further tariffs after the Supreme Court's ruling. Does that make you feel irrelevant, Senator?
Well, the president does have other executive authorities he can deploy as relates to tariffs. I spent most of my private sector career of 28 years before coming to Washington in running global operations. I worked for Procter & Gamble for 13 years, had an assignment over in China for 6 of those years. I was in the software business, having offices in both Australia and Japan. So I've spent a lot of time looking at global operations, looking at trade. What the president is doing, he's really confronting some of the uneven playing fields that have been around the world for many, many years. These tariffs are a tremendous means to a better end, and that is confronting high tariff barriers in many countries as well as non-tariff barriers. When you think about it, 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. So when we think about the future of agriculture, for beef, for wheat, barley, soybeans, corn, and so forth, as well as other exports of American products, including Boeing aircraft, it's important that we've got access to these markets, because that really is where the future growth will be for American businesses.
Well, Senator, I'm really glad to have you. I'm glad that you walked through some of your resume there, because your service at Procter & Gamble, as well as Right Now Technologies, is important to our audience here at Bloomberg TV and radio. And it's why I'd love to hear more from you on the impact of a 15% global tariff that the president says he's pursuing specific to India. I know that you've been an advocate for strengthening U.S.-India trade partnerships, and I wonder if 15% puts a U.S.-India trade deal in jeopardy.
Well, I was just over in Delhi 3 weeks ago. I was, in fact, the new great ambassador, Sergio Gore, who just started his assignment there. I was his first congressional visitor, and I've done business with India for many years. It was very important that we were able to stick the landing between Prime Minister Modi as well as President Trump when they came to agreement on an 18% number. It was about 2 weeks after I came back from Delhi. The India market is incredibly important. The India relationship is incredibly important. India now, of course, is the most populated nation in the world, surpassing China. They're growing at about 7% in their GDP numbers, so it's a big market, big growth. and look at longer-term demographics, it's going to be a very strategic market and partnership for the United States, particularly in a part of the world where we need to pull countries like India and the others on the Pacific Rim close to the United States as we think about broader strategies.
Well, so clearly the president's trade policies have implications for relationships with other countries, India being one. But I'd also like to get into the potential impact here at home. As we know, polling shows us that Americans' perceptions of the economy right now, Senator, are less than stellar under Republican stewardship. I know you are no longer in charge at the NRSC this cycle, at least. But given that you know how difficult it is to look at a map and look to see where you can defend, where you can go on offense, do policies like this make it harder for Republicans to confidently say they can retain the majority in November?
Well, midterms are just always tougher whenever you are the party in power in the White House. That's been the case no matter if it's Democrat or Republican. But face it, though, we were dealt a tough hand coming off the Biden years with massive inflation. That much of that was caused by the incredibly large stimulus bills, these multi-trillion-dollar stimulus bills that we fought hard against. In fact, Lawrence Summers, Clinton's former Secretary of Treasury, warned Democrats this would be inflationary, and indeed it was. Now we've got inflation, numbers like 2.4%. Definitely inflation has come down, but still stuck with some of these fundamental issues of expensive houses and expensive clothes, expensive groceries. But what are we going to do about that? A couple of things. Number one, President Trump has unleashed certainly more made-in-America energy. We've seen gas prices now the lowest in 5 years. That's an important win for the American people, something you're reminded of usually weekly when you're gassing up your vehicle. Number two, when you address affordability, part of the affordability equation is getting more money in the pockets of the American people. And we've seen that with the working family tax cut bill. It's just now starting to go into effect. These are new tax laws that started in 2026. The average U.S. family is going to see about a $3,700 a year benefit from lower taxes. Of course, that's Social Security, no tax for 90% of seniors on Social Security will be affected by that. The no tax on tips, the no tax on overtime. Those are just some of the benefits that have yet to be realized by the American people. They're going to see more of that as you get close to the election. So affordability is not just reducing prices, but also providing more dollars in the paychecks to the American people to close that gap.
It's interesting when we talk about affordability and the impact that tariffs may or may not have on inflation. And we've seen inflation kind of hanging around this very stubborn spot, a little over 2% going back to when the president took office. It hasn't really changed a lot in the last year. And when you hear from the likes of Procter & Gamble, aforementioned, expecting tariffs to cost some $400 million after taxes in fiscal 2026, how do you get to that last mile, Senator, to where consumers are more comfortable going to the store?
Yeah, well, we're encouraged by the reduction we're seeing in energy prices. A really important part of the family budget is what's the price at the gas pump. And again, you're going to see more dollars, net dollars, ending up in the American people's paychecks as these tax cuts kick in. The problem is it's early. You haven't seen that yet kick in as to full extent. That's coming, and I think that'll be part of helping mitigate the high inflation years that we inherited from the Biden administration.
Well, Senator, you've referenced lower gas prices and energy prices overall a few times, and I wonder how much that could be disrupted by what could potentially happen in the Middle East, as the president is openly suggesting if diplomacy does not work, we could see military action in Iran that could threaten to disrupt supply coming out of that region. Senator, do you think that is advisable given what you are saying on how lower energy prices are key to the economic pitch here?
Well, we're in such a different position now than we were many years ago. You go back to the War of Yom Kippur in 1973 when you had Arab countries and the oil embargo. You saw a quadrupling of price of oil. It created massive inflation. A 30-year fixed mortgage back in 1981 was 18.6%. What's true today, though, is that we've decoupled our country from many of the global markets as it relates to oil. We were overly dependent on the Middle East. Today, the United States is the largest producer of oil and oil derivatives in the world, and that helps soften the blows if there is any kind of connected activity going on in Iran. So I'm not as concerned about what happened to oil prices, given the fact that we have done a stellar job, thanks to President Trump and the American energy industry, of becoming much more self-sufficient, and we are now energy dominant. We are an exporter of energy, where once upon a time we were a net importer.
To follow on that, Senator Daines, what should be the trigger for a strike against Iran?
Well, that's a heady question. I'll tell you, the president I know is looking at all options. I've spent a fair amount of time in the Middle East. One thing I do know is you can't trust the current Iranian regime. They are the leading sponsor of terror in the world. This is a regime that preaches death to America. They call the United States the big Satan. They call Israel the little Satan. I don't trust this regime. There's one thing this regime does understand and respect, and that's strength and that's force. So I know there's a lot of variables, a lot of consideration the president has to take into account. But I do not trust the current regime. I was at the Munich Security Conference here a week and a half ago. There were 200,000 Iranians protesting against the current regime in the streets of Munich, Germany. It was an incredible sight. So there's a lot of energy right now to change the regime in Tehran. Most Iranians are pro-West, pro-American, but you've got a regime. They're tyrants. They're brutal. They're going to be hanging students, I understand, here in the next 48 hours who've been protesting. This regime needs to go. The Iranian people need to have the ability to topple that regime. That's not up to the United States to do. That's about the Iranian people. But I know President Trump is playing hardball right now with the Iranian regime, as he should.
Well, I wonder if that hanging might end up being the trigger. Senator, it's great to have you back, and we appreciate your insight. Steve Daines, Republican from Montana, with us live from Capitol Hill on this day after the State of the Union address. We'll hear from a Democrat later this hour. And Maggie Goodlander, the Congresswoman from New Hampshire, will join us.
Stay with us on Balance of Power. We'll have much more coming up after this.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
I am Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where we are fresh off the president's State of the Union address, where we were looking for clues on a number of subjects relevant to financial markets and the economy. Affordability, of course, was looming large, but geopolitical issues did feature as well, specifically when it comes to Iran, amid an amassing of military force from the United States to the Middle East, knowing that diplomacy is still being given a chance here. If you listen at least to President Trump, there are going to be talks in Geneva once again tomorrow between the U.S. and Iran. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, envoys for the president, will be participating in those. But President Trump made it pretty clear that if diplomacy does not prevail, he is not going to hold back from taking action, as he described the threat from Iran, which he also looked back on the attack back in June that the U.S. conducted on Iran's nuclear capabilities specifically. This is how the president characterized the situation last night.
After midnight hammer, they were warned to make no future attempts to rebuild their weapons program, and in particular, nuclear weapons. Yet they continue, starting it all over. We wiped it out, and they want to start all over again, and are at this moment again pursuing their sinister ambitions. We are in negotiations with them. They want to make a deal, but we haven't heard those secret words. We will never have a nuclear weapon. My preference is to solve this problem through diplomacy. But one thing is certain, I will never allow the world's #1 sponsor of terror, which they are by far, to have a nuclear weapon.
That's where we start our conversation with an important voice from Capitol Hill and from the national security space. And Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander, the Democrat from New Hampshire, joins us now live on Bloomberg TV and radio. And Congresswoman, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. Of course, a member of the Armed Services Committee and small business for that matter. I note your status as a military veteran, a former naval officer, an intelligence officer who was also an advisor in the national security space. Now you represent a state that is very sensitive to the military community in New Hampshire. Do you believe that strikes against Iran are inevitable?
Well, thanks so much for having me. You know, as I listened to the president last night, it was really hard to square his statements with the way that he's conducting himself when it comes to Iran. We know that decisions about war and peace, these are the most consequential decisions that a person in public trust, at a position of public trust, could ever make. These are questions about American lives and about American taxpayer dollars. The president has not yet been clear about what his objectives are in Iran. What are our goals here? He said again last night that Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated. So it doesn't quite square up with what his objectives might be. The president has not answered the question of what he would be prepared to do. And the reason that the Constitution entrusts Congress with the power to declare war and with important war-making powers is to be a check and to make sure that we get the answer right. That's exactly why we have the War Powers Resolution and why presidents rely on the check of Congress and the blessing of Congress before proceeding with these most consequential questions. And the final thing that he hasn't answered is what comes next. And look, the American people do not want to be in another forever war that's going to cost us in American lives and in taxpayer dollars. So these are basic questions that the president has not given clear answers to. And that's a huge problem.
Well, so when we consider the American lives, knowing that more Americans have been deployed to the region, the Financial Times had reporting today, citing an insider with the Iranian regime, suggesting that Iran, and this is a quote, would move toward escalation, targeting anything within reach from U.S. bases to the Strait of Hormuz and American warships in response if attacked. If you're on an American warship in that region right now, Congresswoman, are you prepared to withstand such an attack? Is it inevitable that if Iran were to choose that course of action in response, that we would see the loss of American life?
Look, we have the greatest and most powerful military in the history of the world. The United States military is extraordinary, extremely capable, unmatched right now. But the fact that we're reading in news reports, I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee, and I'm getting my best information from news articles about what the terms of the debate are here, what our objectives are, what our military planning looks like. And from news reports, I think there is understandable and grave concern about what the range of military options could look like. This is why Congress is a check for the president. This is why the president should come to Congress. His power to wage war is not boundless, just like his power to wage trade wars and to tax the American people with tariffs is not boundless. And he was reminded of that last week. And it would be wise for him to come to the Congress and to have a real conversation about what our objectives here, because the truth is there is strong bipartisan support for the basic proposition that this Iranian regime, which is a brutal and determined enemy of the United States, should never get a nuclear weapon. There is strong bipartisan support for that proposition. But the way the president has chosen to go about this, and you saw it on full display in his State of the Union last night, which was the most divisive State of the Union in American history, in addition to being the longest. He's not building consensus on an issue that really needs buy-in from both branches of our government that are entrusted by the American people and our Constitution with war powers.
Well, so you're not being briefed on anything, Congresswoman, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, which tracks with everything we've heard from other members of the committee, even on both sides of the aisle. This is limited to the Gang of Eight, I guess, so far. What do you then make, with just based on your experience and what you're hearing in Washington, what do you make of the conventional wisdom that no nation, including this one, has ever assembled this much military might in one place without using it?
Well, I'm a student of history, and history's got to be our guide. But in my job now, I'm a congresswoman who is going to demand answers from a president who is refusing to recognize our role under this Constitution in questions of war and peace. And what I know for sure is that the American people do not want to go into another forever war. They don't want to put the lives of American service members and their taxpayer dollars on the line for a half-baked and, frankly, unclear strategy. And it doesn't have to be this way. And it's always the right time to do the right thing, and I hope the president will do that.
Well, Congresswoman, as we consider where American tax dollars are directed, there is not a dollar right now going to funding the Department of Homeland Security, which remains shut down now for a 12th day amid a dispute between your party and the White House over reforms to ICE. Do you see an end in sight here, Congresswoman? Because as you cite needing to see news articles to see what is happening with regard to Iran, I don't even think there are many news articles that can say definitively that there's been any progress made in these talks. Are the talks even happening between your leadership and the administration?
Well, the first thing to say is there is no reason. We have agreement on funding all of the law-abiding components of the Department of Homeland Security. There is no reason, good reason, other than to cause unnecessary pain to hardworking federal public servants, for the Speaker to have hit the gavel and sent the House of Representatives home today without funding TSA, FEMA, and the vast majority of the Department of Homeland Security, which is not at issue here. The issue here is really about putting into place common sense guardrails, common sense checks on the powers that ICE and CBP have been exercising in communities across this country, unchecked powers. Yesterday, what happened in the state of New Hampshire, I think really should be a model for the rest of the country. We learned in press reports at the end of December that ICE had launched a nationwide campaign to commandeer industrial warehouses to warehouse human beings. And quickly and with one voice, Republicans and Democrats in every corner of our state spoke out against this to say, you cannot proceed with this kind of expensive, questionable, un-American plan without the consent and without the buy-in of local communities. And yesterday, we were victorious in this campaign. These are the kinds of common sense checks that the American people need and deserve from federal law enforcement. Public safety, at the end of the day, depends on public trust. And public trust is impossible when you have a federal law enforcement apparatus that is sending masked agents into our communities, shooting American citizens dead in broad daylight, defying the Fourth Amendment by breaking into Americans' homes without judicial warrants, surveying our communities in ways we've never seen before, except in other countries. I mean, what we are asking for are common sense guardrails that have the overwhelming support of the American people, and it is a decision that the Speaker and the President have made to inflict pain on public servants who shouldn't be working a day without a paycheck, at the same moment that members of Congress are getting paid without actually doing their jobs, which is why I will never accept a paycheck when any federal public servant is at risk of working without pay. It's just dead wrong. The incentives are backwards, and we've got a bipartisan bill to fix that. But in the meantime, there is a path, and this is the work of legislating. We've got to keep trying to build support to get on it, but it does very much exist. It's very clear to me.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. Democratic Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander of New Hampshire.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.